Hello, friend. Welcome to a special, different kind of adventures in design episode. If you're listening to this on release, it is Tuesday, September the 11th, 2018. 17 years after the terrorist attacks that hit the East Coast of the United States of America. 17 long but very quick years. And I wanted to do this episode today because I'm afraid in some ways we've really gotten very far away from that moment. Today's show is different. There's no theme song. There's no ads. There's no sponsorships. There's no call to action. There's no bonus content. It's just literally my tell, the way that I lived through Tuesday, September the 11th, 2001. If you decide to take this path with me to listen to this episode, obviously we all know, spoiler alert, the horrible stuff that happened that day. But in many ways, it was a turning point in my life. And I hope to tell you how good things can happen even amongst the worst moments in history. If you want to skip out on today's episode, no offense taken. I just feel like I don't want to let this moment go. And I also don't want to become numb to September 11th. I don't want to make it feel like another day. And I certainly don't want America to allow it to become a holiday or a September 11th day sale at their store. There's a really great ad campaign that's going on that is promoting, 30% off our September 11th day sale, in-store savings on September 11th. And as you watch this commercial, Beth and I just got outraged. We was like, hold on. What despicable company is using September 11th as a day to move the needle on their sales? Then at the end of it, you see that it's actually a well-made piece of art to trigger that action in you, to trigger that response of like, no, you can't do this to September 11th. It's sort of a weird sacred day here in America. And then at the end, it's a call to action to a September 11th awareness group. Forgive me for not knowing the exact campaign. I just saw it on TV one day, and it literally stopped me dead on my tracks because unfortunately the color hues and swatches of the ad was just the same as an IKEA ad that had ran before. And I was like, those Swedish fucks, what are they doing? You can't do this. What's happening here? And then afterwards, I saw it was for a 9/11 information campaign. And that really triggered something in my mind of, man, I don't want to go on this year, business as usual. I want to stop. I want to pump the brakes. And I think that I'm ready to actually share my story on how this horrible moment in history actually had a little bit of silver in the lining, if you will. And if you look hard enough, and I don't want to be somebody that always says PMA and then doesn't actually try to embrace it. So my 9/11 story actually starts 12/11 the year before. That would be December 11th, 2000, for those of you that are keeping score. My dad had just turned 46, and 3 days before, I had just turned 26. I left home at 18. I left home as soon as I turned 18. So if you do the math, I had been living on my own for 8 years that December. When I left home, unlike most people that, they move out, but they come back to do laundry and they still stay over at their parents and they go there and eat their food, I had pretty much, I won't say cut my family off, but I left. And when I left, my stepmom demanded that I give them my key to the house and that the things inside that house belonged to them. And so therefore, I left with that just piss and vinegar pumping through my blood that I would prove them wrong, that I was 100% right, that I was capable of taking care of myself. And I vowed to myself, no matter what, I will never go back to that home and spend the night. I will never go back to that home looking for resources. I have got to do this. I've got to make it on my own. A lot to go through when you're also a senior in high school, but it was what I had to do. So it was what I did. So in that 8-year run, my relationship with my dad was strained. my dad and I didn't identify on many common bonds. Obviously, he wasn't into skateboarding or punk rock, and he also wasn't into my view on life. And that now I realize is a pretty typical way for fathers and sons to be in that lost years period. And now looking back on it, I understand my dad more. He wanted me to settle down, to have a career, to figure out what it is that I wanted to do. Me, on the other hand, I had this band that kept showing more and more promise year after year, but it was never quite going around that turn of being 100% the way that I could earn my income. So my dad was seeing a young man who was spinning out of control. I would leave for 3 and 4 months at a time. I would come back, work a shitty job for a couple of months, and then quit that job if it got in the way of my dream. I was putting a dream over reality, and my dad never had that luxury. Here's a man who lied when he was 14 that said he was 16 and talked him into getting a job that you had to be 18 to get. He worked every day, sacrificed everything, put it into his family, didn't know vacations, didn't know traveling, didn't know the world. I believe at this moment in time, my dad had maybe seen, I don't know, I'm going to go out on a limb here, do some monkey math, maybe 8 states, the path from Kentucky to Florida. And I would know that he went and saw his aunt in Minneapolis once. And that was it. That was this man's complete understanding of the United States, of where he'd been. He was a truck driver that would drive the same routes, and he was a truck driver that would be home every night, which means that he sacrificed his greatest income, his greatest earning potential, to actually be around and to be present. Because to all respect to my dad, his dad never was. My dad's dad, my grandfather, if you will, Roy Brickey, lived on the streets, died on the streets, an alcoholic. When I was a skateboarder, we'd be downtown skateboarding, and a couple of times I looked over and saw a homeless guy, and just like in a very poor made TV drama, that's my grandpa over there. That's my grandpa. I had met him a couple of times. I have a memory for every face that I see, and I could place him. And so it's a weird moment when your grandfather is the guy passing the White Castle in downtown Louisville. But that is the dad, the father that my dad was given. And so what he did was the best that he could do with the tools that he was given in life. But it doesn't make it any easier for me when I'm living through an existence of on sitcoms, on dramas. Parents talk to their children. We didn't talk. Parents told their kids that they loved them. We didn't do that. And I had a lot of friends whose lives looked a lot more like TV than mine. So I felt alienated. I felt alone. And I felt the disappointment of a father. And nothing will break a young man's heart more than feeling like the man that he's always looked up to just doesn't think that he's man enough. And from a financial point of view, my dad was right. I was a fuck up. I was gambling my life on rock and roll, working part-time jobs, coming and going, chasing women, not really making any dent into a future. And this is a man who's worked every day to provide for his family, to get that little bit ahead each month, and banked it all on you work hard, one day you retire. I actually remember putting all my stuff together after the band broke up to move to Toronto, Ontario. And I actually remember getting into a fight with my dad as I was leaving town, because for whatever reason, we kind of got a little bit closer right before I left. And I think it was just me putting in the effort to be like, oh, it's going to be kind of weird to not live near my family, even though, quite honestly, in the last couple of years, I'd maybe gone and seen my parents 4 times a year, 5 times a year, didn't talk to them on the phone. I mean, they were over in Southern Indiana. I was over in Louisville, and the space between the two of us was a few miles, but it could have been a few thousand miles But there towards the end when I was moving, I think that I made an extra effort. And I remember before making this big life change that me and my dad actually got into a fight because I was wearing a black sweater that had dog hair on it because I own 2 dogs. And I remember my dad just being like, just mad, angry at me that I would wear a shirt that would have lint and dog hair all over it because he's the type of guy who's immaculate with everything that he owns. He's a complete neat freak. In fact, when he got rid of his old pickup truck, I swear to you that if you sit in this truck, you would not know that somebody had owned it for like 10, 15 years. Like it looked like it just came off the assembly line. Immaculate. His home, immaculate. Everything that he owns is just spotless. And I'm a fucking mess. Because when you're around people that constantly clean up after you, the one thing that you don't learn is how to be clean yourself. Like I have junk all around me in my office today because I don't know where it goes. I just don't know. I want to pick it up. I want to get rid of it. But then when I hold it in my hands, there's this panic of, but where does it belong? So it's easier to set it down, to ignore it and move on. This is how I've been my whole adult life. I hate it. It'll probably be how I die. But I remember fighting with my dad over something so silly. I was making a major life move. I was gambling once again. I was giving up on Louisville, Kentucky, where I had tons of friends and it was rooted in the business community there. And lots of people knew who I was for the good and for the bad. I'd earned quite a reputation being a rock and roller there for so many years. But the point is I was dialed in to Louisville, Kentucky. And I was moving to Toronto, another country, a massive city. It was a complete life change because that's what I knew that I needed. And to fight over a shirt having dog hair on it and worried about me sitting in his truck and getting the dog hair on the seat in his truck, it just really brought home to me, I just got to get out of here. I don't want to fight about such trivial things. I don't even understand the importance of this. In fact, there's so much dog hair in my life, I could probably make another dog. And that is just, it's beyond me. Like there's so many big problems going on of trying to figure out, I just left the band. You know, I just gave up on a dream. I've got to get out of here. I can't let people see me as the guy that failed. You know, everybody knew that I was this guy that was banking his whole life on this band. I have got to get out of here. I can't be seen as the guy that quit. I got to go someplace and refresh the browser, reset the clock. So to be worried about what's on my shirt, I don't give a fuck. I'm worried about what's on my perception. How am I seeing me? How are people seeing me? I've got to get out of here. And so to argue about something so trivial made it even easier to get into a Nissan Pathfinder, load it up with what would fit in there. And keep in mind, the back area where you keep the cargo, that's where Baxter and Soda had to ride. So didn't leave with a lot of stuff, but I'd done this before when I moved out in 1993 as a senior in high school with everything that would fit. And at the time, get ready to be impressed, my Chevy Cavalier. I'd made this move before. I'd loaded up what I could fit into a car and set off onto a great gamble. Once to be a kid in high school living on his own, and this time to live in another country, to get far away. So you're probably asking yourself, why Toronto? Well, there's a couple answers here. The real answer is, why not New York City? I wanted to live in New York City so badly. I always loved the city, and I've been going there since I was very young because that's where my mother transplanted to, my estranged mother at this moment in time. I haven't spoke to my mom in 15 years now. That's where we're at. I believe that's the anniversary that we're hitting. But my mother lived, I'm assuming maybe she still does, maybe she doesn't, maybe she's not alive, in the Long Island area. And this is kind of how my mom rolls. I visited my mom when I was 17, maybe 18. I think it was 17 when I visited her. I don't know. It all gets kind of foggy. And I wanted to see New York City. She lived out on Long Island. So my mom's style of parenting is, I'm going to take you to the train. Get off at this train. Get on this train. Get off. Probably pop up at Washington Square Park. You'll probably like that part of town. All right. And there I am in New York City on my own. And I liked it so much. And I met some other punk rock kids that I stayed for 3 days. Hey, Mom, you know how you just sent me into the biggest city in America by myself? Yeah, sure, son. Well, I met some kids. I'm going to crash with them in this tiny apartment and hang out for a couple more days. Oh, yeah, okay, cool. I'll see you when you get back. Just, could you imagine doing that if you're a parent? Holy shit. And New York was scary then. It wasn't what it is today. Being from Kentucky is great. And I'm actually from Kentuckiana, the Indiana-Kentucky border. But being from Kentucky, because that's easier to say and for people to understand, and it all identifies under the shadow of the great Louisville, Kentucky, it is a great place to be from. It adds character. People think that it's cool. There's a rich history. But I don't want to be there. There's a big difference in being from there and actually being there. And no offense to my friends that are still there. It's worked out well for all of you, and I'm proud of you. But I just had to leave. And so the whole time that the band was on tour, every city I went to was auditioning for the place that I would live. And I love New York the most. But even though I'm a gambler and a fearless guy, New York was a little bit too scary for me. I had finally got a Pathfinder, like a Nissan Pathfinder, like a legitimate SUV, because me and my friends, we did a music festival, and one time we did really, really well. My friend Andy Rich gave me more money than I'd ever held in my hands before, and I was afraid I'd do something stupid with it, so I just went and bought a car, because that was like, what do I do with this money? I know that I'll do something dumb with it. I can't be trusted. Like, in between the next tour, I'll end up living off of it, and then I won't have anything to show for it. I'm just going to go buy a car. And I'd always wanted an SUV, which sounds kind of familiar to where I'm at right now, right? If you listen to the show pretty regularly. So I didn't want to get rid of my car. I've always had a car. What would it be like to live someplace where you weren't allowed to have a car? And then the number one reason was Baxter and Soda. These two dogs were my world. Baxter taught me more lessons than any person I'd ever met. He was my first dog that I ever had as an adult. And I was just worried about, what would the sacrifice be? Can I find a place with two dogs? What would I do for work? How would I make this transition happen? And I liked Toronto. I liked it a lot. There was a vibe to the city. It felt like New York, but it also was 35% off because of the strong US dollar. And in my mind, I said, you know what? They film stuff in Toronto all the time to make it look like New York City and to get those tax incentives. You know, I love the entertainment industry. Why not live like the entertainment industry, right? Go to the place that looks like where you want to shoot, but enjoy the tax break, which for me was, I was still going to make US money doing web design work, you know, graphics and stuff, you know, just the graphic designer lifestyle. You can work from anywhere. Your clients can be anywhere. I'm going to do that whole thing. The money will be made in the US and I'll spend it in Canada. And so therefore, every $100 I made was $135. Every $1,000 I made was $1,350. Worked out well. Seemed like a lot better of an option, a lot safer of an option than New York City. And for whatever reason, I like the fact that it was only 600 miles away from home, from my family. And 600 miles can seem like a lot, or it can seem like a little when you live 2,000 miles away from home like I do today. But it was a space. It was a big enough space. It was far enough away that it could feel like a fresh start, a new start. And I could live in a big city that I'd always dreamed about. I could live submerged in culture. And I was really, really excited to have that lifestyle, because I always enjoyed going out on the road with the band, going to big cities and just being around all of that. And then when I would come home, I'd be reminded of just how small Louisville was and how I just wanted more. I wanted more of a buzz around me of people coming and going. And I also like the idea of being lost in a city and people not knowing who you are, which definitely wasn't a thing that I experienced when I lived in Louisville during the time that I did. So the reason why we start here is to explain to you that my dad and I, we weren't close when I left. We weren't close at all. We didn't really have anything that we could talk about. We didn't have anything that we saw eye to eye on. It just was disappointing talking to him, because he would ask me about my life. I would tell him about my life, and he couldn't get excited about the things that I was excited about, because all he could focus on was, where are you going? Where is all this leading? You're not doing anything that resembles what an adult should be doing. Once again, I realize he was right, but I was right too. You know, you should be willing to sacrifice if you really want something in this world. But my dad was right, because he just wanted his only son, his oldest child out of two, to not be a burden on society. And meanwhile, I never asked him for $1, but I think he was just like, how's this guy going to take care of himself? And it was so different than what he had done. And that was by design. I had always been a huge fan of my dad. I thought he was a great guy. And I listened to him every day when he would come home from work and complain about his job or the pay. And I just always told myself, not me. You think nobody's listening to your dad, but I am. I hear you. It's all going into my brain. And every time you're complaining about your world, I'm hearing it as, don't do what I did. And I didn't. I don't have any kids. I definitely didn't get a girl pregnant at the age of 19. I didn't have to sacrifice everything to become a dad, to become a father. I didn't get dialed in to buying the house and having the bills and following a life of putting stuff into my 401k. Like, I've just been wild and reckless, and I've always focused on me. Living in Toronto was interesting because I got the big burst of city life that I was looking for. I was submerged in the culture, and I absolutely loved it. It was the first time in my life that I really, really ever felt like I was someplace where I belonged. And I loved being there. I loved being anonymous. I loved that the city didn't give two shits about me. And I loved it way more than it ever loved me back. And I like that. That's my comfort zone. That's where I feel good. And as I would live there and enjoy it, every now and again, I'd call back home because I couldn't see my parents. And so in a weird way, the distance forced me to be like, oh, I should probably call my dad. And so calling back home and talking to my dad, I started to kind of sell him on where I was living, what it was like. And my experience became interesting to him. And so for once, we had something to talk about, because I could be like, oh, guess what? We take subways everywhere here, or there's a streetcar, or guess what? When you get on the streetcar in Chinatown and a little Asian lady like plows through you like she's a defensive lineman for the Pittsburgh Steelers, you're not offended by that because it's a cultural thing. My dad's like, really? I'm like, oh yeah, these little old ladies will plow through you. And the first time you want to get mad, you want to say something, and then you just realize, oh, it's a cultural difference. And it's amazing because I was raised in a neighborhood where you're either black or you're white. So living in a place where the Olympic Council studied that it was the most culturally diverse city in America when I lived there, it was great. I got to see so many different things and so many different types of people, and I could go out and find just wild shit to get into. I mean, that city is amazing. It is humming with culture. And there's just a way that Canada does it just right. The people there, I was always the loudest person there. I was always the most obnoxious person there. You know, they find this lane, they stay in it, and they just do their thing, and they do it so well. It's like, you know, the good parts of England, the good parts of the US, and just kind of perfectly blended together in this really, really wild melting pot. So by selling it to my dad, he's like, well, we want to come up and we want to visit you. Okay. You want to take vacation time and come see me? I mean, you realize I live in a city and there's no fucking way that you can stay with me. And that was for a lot of reasons, which I think you could probably figure out because I did leave town fighting about dog hair on my sweater. So therefore, no, you could come see where I live, but you're not staying with me. Oh, no. We'll get a hotel. I'll give you my credit card. You book us a hotel in the right part of town. And because, you know, my dad's thing was he never traveled a lot because he didn't want to go someplace where he didn't know anyone. You know, he'd always say when I was a kid, best place about going someplace where you know someone that lives there is they get to show you where to go. So for my dad, going to Toronto felt easy and understandable because I could be his Canadian Sherpa and show him around the city. So here it was. For the first time as adults, we would go someplace other than his living room or his back porch. Dad was coming to Canada. He was coming to see me in Toronto. So to make it as easy as possible, I met my dad on the outskirts of town. I met him outside of Hamilton, Ontario. We took his big red Silverado pickup truck, and he owned it back then. God, how long did he have that thing? We took his big red pickup truck. We parked it at a GO station, which is the train that commutes from, you know, the smaller communities into Toronto. You can even take it over to Montreal and beyond. We leave the big truck, the big American truck, in a parking lot. Dad hops in the Nissan Pathfinder, covered in dog hair. I actually remember when I picked him up, I had just got the car detailed and the seats were still damp because I got everything shampooed. It was a little bit damp, but I wanted to get it as hair-free as possible. That was the stress that my dad put me through. So we get in the Pathfinder. We leave his car because I didn't want him to have to worry about driving in the city because I knew that would be all of the triggers and that what parking would cost would make him insane. And so I picked him up. We get into my car and we head into the city. And I still remember my dad's face seeing me drive in 5 lanes of traffic. At this moment, I was totally dialed in to the 401 and the Gardner and the QEW and just cruising, just cruising along. And at one moment, he was like, can you slow down a little bit? I'm like, oh, yeah. Sorry. You just kind of get used to the flow. We get into the city. I booked him at the Sheraton right downtown. So he's staying in a high rise, lived a little bit further away by design. And I'm like, here you are. Here's where you're staying. We get checked in. I go get rid of the Pathfinder, let out the dogs. I come back down. We have a great dinner. And I feel like, okay, we're going to be able to do this. We're not in his home. We're not in my home. We're kind of in neutral territory. We're hanging out at a hotel. We're going out to eat at a restaurant. He's in a city where he feels intimidated. So he's looking to me for the first time to sort of guide him. There's an even playing field here. I think that we're actually going to get along for the week. This might work out. We part ways. A good solid first night. No arguing, no fighting. Probably the first time in my adult life that I felt on par with the old man. Next morning, I get up. My girlfriend, she worked at an ad agency in downtown Toronto. We send her off, and then me, my dad, and my stepmom, we go to a diner on Queen Street. I can still remember walking in, seeing the yellow booths with the cream white tabletops. I can remember the way that the egg yolks looked on my plate, and I can remember the hum of an AM radio in the back. We stepped outside. It was beautiful. I mean, a perfect September fall day. Sky had just the most beautiful shade of blue in it. Couple of little white clouds here and there that were just brilliant, bright white. A breeze coming through. Fall was at our fingertips, and it just felt great outside. I actually remember standing in the median, because Queen Street is so big to cross it, you have to go over one side of traffic. You stay in the middle where you can also catch the streetcar, and then you cross the second side. So sometimes it takes, 2 red lights to get across. And I remember standing in the median and my dad just going, man, it really is beautiful out here today. And I said, yeah, you guys picked the perfect time to come up. And then we crossed the street corner because we were doing an L, right? You go across one, you get to that corner, and then you do the L to go to the other. As we're standing on that corner, I'll never forget what I heard. A yellow taxi cab comes around the corner, radio on, guy driving, looked to be maybe a Jamaican cab driver, and he had his radio turned up. And as he spun around, I heard on the radio that a plane had flew into one of the towers in New York City. I said, hey, Dad, did you hear that cabbie's car go by? No, what did he say? He said something about New York City. A plane flew into a building in New York City, and they don't know what's happening yet. Well, what do you say we go back up to the hotel room and turn on the TV and see what's going on? Yeah, that sounds good. So we abandon the sidewalk. We go up to the top of the hotel where my dad was staying. Obviously we had to walk over there. We weren't standing in front of it. And that's when we turned on the TV and realized that the world had changed. Forgive me where this part of my memory may be factually inaccurate. This is the way that I remember it. This is the way that it is in my heart. I remember getting up there and seeing the first tower that got hit. I remember seeing it smoking. And I want to say that I remember seeing the second one get hit. But that could not be true. It could be, the footage that we've seen. But I remember that we got there early and that there was the chaos around one building getting hit. And then I remember when it compounded, that it then felt very, very scary. And to live your whole life in a 1-bedroom ranch house in Jeffersonville, Indiana, like my dad had, and to be in a high rise in a city that looks just like New York, and to see these big buildings get hit, it did definitely make us question our surroundings and what was going on. I mean, it made it a different experience to see that. So as the chaos was unfolding, because we had just eaten breakfast on the street. I mean, all of this happens at 9:00 in the morning. I mean, we're right at the TV as soon as the feed goes live. We're watching it all go down, and we're watching it all go down probably 20 stories up in a high-rise hotel. And we couldn't quite process what was going on. And I told my dad, I said, hey, if you don't mind, I'm going to kill the volume on the TV. I want to listen to what Stern's saying, because he's not too far from there in New York City. So we turned down the TV and we turned up the little radio on the nightstand, the little clock alarm radio. And we listened to Howard from New York, and we listened to those guys talk. Now, I've gone back and listened to that Howard Stern episode several times. It used to be my 9/11 anniversary. And it's funny because right before the tower gets attacked, they were talking about shark attacks and Pam Anderson. And think about how pointless shark attacks, because that summer, 2001 summer, there was a lot of shark attacks on beaches. So sharks were the enemy, and they were talking about to Pamela Anderson. And just think about that is the best thing that you have to broadcast about. And then this happens not too far from you. Howard was great that morning. He stayed on way past his exit time. He basically stayed until he felt like they'd talked it out, they'd exhausted it out. But it was awesome to listen to that real talk. You know, Tom Brokaw over on NBC, because I've always been an NBC guy. They have to go by the network's rules. They have to say things as it's been vetted, as it's been approved. They can't give out quote unquote fake news. But Howard and the gang, they can just riff, right? They can real talk it. They can talk about how they're really feeling. If they're feeling, people were calling in and saying they felt scared. People were calling in from Brooklyn rooftops saying that they could see the smoke. People were calling in and they were angry. They already had a suspect of who it was and they were saying mean shit. But that's kind of everything that you were feeling, right? Like you wanted to be mad. You wanted revenge. You were sad. You felt bad for those people. Like you couldn't even comprehend how many people could be in those two buildings. I mean, we now know that the number was actually quite small compared to what it could have been, right? I mean, if you load up both of those buildings full of people humming at 4:00 on a Monday, way, way different than everybody just kind of slowly loading in on a Monday morning. But we didn't know this then. We also didn't know that they were going to fall. And we didn't know the tidal wave, just the sheer tidal wave of dust and debris that would flood through the streets. And I remember seeing those cameras just get overtaken by that smoke monster that was buildings and jet fuel and human remains and dreams and fathers and mothers and daughters and brothers and sons and grandsons and granddaughters. I mean, just a tidal wave of everything going on. And the saddest moment of it all was the footage of the volunteers, all the people lined up on the curb at the hospital, waiting for this rush of people that they were going to give medical treatment to. They were waiting for the survivors, and they never came. Putting all this together in real time, when you didn't know what we all know now, it was an insane emotional roller coaster to go down. And I know it isn't unique to me because you did it too. But where the story for me changes is that I went through this with my dad, not one of my best friends, but my dad, who I'd never really considered a friend. He was just this guy that I always looked up to, and quite honestly, that I always disappointed. And we're kind of sitting there in downtown Toronto watching this, and this weird evolution in our relationship starts to happen where we're in this together, man. Like, we're Americans in a different country. We're family, and we're in this crisis together. Later on that day, my poor dad's bad luck, they shut down the border. So get this right. My old man leaves the United States for the first time. Within 24 hours, America has been attacked and the border is locked up. No one can come, no one can go. And by the way, all of the planes that couldn't go into New York City were flown to Toronto. So anybody that maybe was trying to do something else just landed where we're at. There was no threat, but you don't know this at the time. So we watched an insane amount of TV. We listened to Howard until Howard finally parted ways. And that day when he got off the radio, he and his wife got into a helicopter, left the city, and went out to their place in the Hamptons. And my dad and I just sit there and we watch news. Eventually, I had to run back to my apartment and let out Baxter and soda. So I told my dad, I said, look, I got to go home. I got to let out the dogs. My girlfriend will be getting off from work. Let me go do all that. Then we'll come back down here. We'll grab you guys and we'll just get away from the TV and we'll go out to eat someplace. So as I go down the high rise there, and I'm walking through the streets, walking down Queen Street to go to the Young subway station. It was just like, what is happening? What happened? What is going on? And I can't believe I'm experiencing all of this with my dad. I remember that would be the first time that I would get out on the streets and walk, and where we were at wasn't too far from Much Music, which is CTV, right? It's like the big Canadian TV network, and they have different, Much Music's one of their channels. Anyways, I'm getting lost in the details here, but they're like a TV producer, TV network. They make several different TV channels in Canadian TV. And they had the big window, that normally has all the TVs in it that show what different shows they have going on or what's live on their different channels. It's hard for me to get this out because it was so surreal that when I walked past it, that it was just the Twin Towers on all these TVs, smoking, planes going into it, just replaying the day's events. And there were people crowded around it. And how many movies have we seen this in? Whether it's a superhero film or a disaster film, the people on the street crowded around the window that is just covered with TVs telling them what happened. It was surreal. I'd always wanted to live inside of a movie, and the day that it happened, it was a little bit scary. Finally made my way down to the subway platform to catch the subway back home to let out my dogs. And, this is 2001 technology. So when you go down the stairs, there used to be a big display, just one color. It was red on black, just a LED display that would give you updates, your train's this far. And I remember going down the stairs, waiting for the subway, and there were no, your train's 15 minutes away, or there was no, trains closed tonight at 1:30. It was New York City under attack. And just the weight of that. Like, I'll never forget how it felt. And maybe being such a lover of TV and film, it made it feel surreal. Like, it made it feel like I'd walked into the set of something, and maybe that's like a defense mechanism to not think about how fucking crazy it is that New York City is under attack. And that was the moment that it dawned on me that if I would have pivoted differently, it's where I would have been that day. Man. So I took the train home, and there were my sweet and innocent dogs. They don't know what's going on. I let them out, took them over to the park. Me and all the guys over at the park, just, everybody's dumbfounded. I let the dogs in. I hop back on the subway. The girlfriend gets off from work, and I end up back at the hotel to get the parents. And my dad just wearing his normal attire. He just has some sort of like beer shirt on, that has or like a Ralph Lauren shirt or some shit like that. Just dad shirt, white shirt with graphics on it. And the graphics a big American flag. And I go, let's not wear that. He's like, why? And I had to explain to my dad, I'm like, there's people out on the streets right now that feel just like you and I do. There's also people out on the streets right now because we're in a different country and these people come from different parts of the globe. There's people out there right now that 100% are stoked that this happened. We don't know how the night's going to go down. You don't want to be a target. Now, maybe that's unpatriotic. Maybe this is me showing my first signs of being afraid or fearful. But I knew the landscape of Toronto. I knew the element of punk rockers and anarchists and people that lived there that just didn't like America. I had heard plenty of people talk shit about America to me as if I were a Canadian. And I took it as an honor that I'm like, hey, I'm really blended in here. But I know not everyone loves us. And that particular day, I just thought, maybe wear something different, Dad. And he switched his shirt and we went out, and I'm glad that we did, because there were clearly some people that were stoked that this had happened. And, you know, there were the people that were excited about it, but there was many, many more people that felt like we did. But there was just that little bit of resistance that I pick up on, that I'm cued into, because I've been a punk rocker. I've always been around the anarchists. I've always been around the subculture. I know how to spot it. I know how to identify it. I also knew the streets and the parts of town not to go into as an American with his parents with them. But as we get down on the street, we walk past the big display of all the TVs, and there it was still playing. And now the sun's gone down, and it felt surreal that this was the day that we had experienced. I remember that restaurants were closed, and we ended up eating out of all places pizza, because it was open. We could just walk in and do it, and nobody was really in the mindset to find fine dining or make it complicated. Took my dad back to his hotel. We hung out a little bit more, and we parted ways that day. The next couple of days, we had always had the plan to take him down to Niagara Falls. We go down to Niagara Falls. We're waiting to see when the border's going to open back up. Eventually, the border did open back up. I think my dad had to stay in Canada maybe a day longer or 2 days longer than what he intended. But the borders opened back up. He had to drive through a military checkpoint. Took forever to get across, but he did it, and he made it back. And this experience of being out of country, being away, not knowing when America was going to open back up its doors and allow people back in, being sort of these fish out of water. And I know that it's Canada, it's not that drastic, but it was just enough to make us feel even more bonded through the situation. And so, as you know, all you wanted to do then was watch the news and see the next little bit of information that would come out. Doesn't feel too different than the last couple of years. But as we would digest this new world that we were living in, me and my dad, we were doing it together. We were experiencing this together. And it created a very interesting father and son bond. It was a bonding experience that we were in this weird way to witness this world event on vacation in a different country, but together. And I think that my dad was able to see me for the first time ever as a man. He saw me navigate the city. He saw how intimidating it was and how I fit in. I think for the first time ever, my dad got to see me in my element. And he got to see that I'm not this lost soul, but indeed in the world, I'm a quarterback. Whatever I do, I take charge, I take control, and I know what's going on. It's just the game that I'm playing looks different than the game that he's playing. But make no mistake that in my world, I am the shot caller, and that I know where I'm going, what I'm doing. So to him, it always seemed like this mess, just scattered out all over the floor. Then there's no direction. But I think living in my world, forced to live in my world, my dad saw that I did have a plan, that I had taken all of my talents and experiences and matured them into something that was worthwhile, and that the story was still being told. And hey, 17 years later, still here telling it. I remember looking around, I really wanted an American flag for my car. Crazy to think that at the time you couldn't just find an American flag because, you know, capitalism always responds and you could find an American flag anywhere you wanted by October. But I remember when we were in Toronto, I was kind of looking around. I just wanted like a basic American flag. I didn't want it to say anything. I didn't want an eagle's tears on it. I just wanted a U.S. flag to put on the back of my truck. And after I parted ways, said goodbye to my dad, when he got home, the first thing he did was he found an American flag sticker for me at a store somewhere, and he mailed it to me. And that felt like the beginning of an understanding. It felt like that we had gone through this wild thing And we had something to talk about. Now, granted, it's a horrible moment in U.S. history, but because we experienced it together, we were both, curious about what's going to happen next. We started talking on the phone more. And we started talking about this. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think we're going to go to war? Did you hear this little bit of news that just leaked? Did you just hear that was false? And my dad started listening to Howard, started listening to Stern. So a little bit more of our world opened up. And me kind of technically living in Buffalo, New York, because that's where my bank was. That's where my P.O. box was. I was still a U.S. citizen. I got dialed in to loving the Buffalo Bills that fall because football became this big moment of the flyovers, the flag. It became tethered into being patriotic, which is also weird to think about today. So I started to understand the game of football, which then gave us another talking point. And so my dad and I, we were finding a common language. We were finding a way to talk to each other about things that we cared about because we'd actually, for the first time ever, we had lived together. We had lived through something. The hierarchy was gone. It was no longer, do what I tell you. Why aren't you doing it right? It was, shit, what do you think is going to happen next? I don't know. What do you think is going to happen next? There was a dialogue developing. There was a conversation between us. And that conversation has now been going on for 17 years today. The country music singer Alan Jackson created a song that was, I believe it's called Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning? It was a September 11th tribute song. And man, oh man, don't play that song around me because it will break me down into tears. And I remember when that song from Alan Jackson hit, I remember listening to it and knowing my dad knows the song because he knows country music. My dad raised me on country music and early rock and roll. It's been something I always enjoyed. And I kind of like that, a lot of people are like, oh, I like music, but I don't like country. No, I like all music because I like country and I can understand it. And in many ways, it's the roots of where I come from. So when that song came out, I believe that I sat in front of my computer and I just emotionally unloaded. And let me pause this for a second. I got to figure out when that song comes out to give you a direct timeline. I'm back. Did you miss me? That song was released November 7th, 2001. So and a couple of months later, and mind you, in the gap between, I had been to New York City. I'd been to 9/11. I had walked up to the spot where the buildings went down. And when I was there, just about 6 weeks after it happened, it was still smoking. I can remember what all the buildings looked like, charred. And I remember the storefronts that were untouched, covered in the ash. I also remember the fences lined with love letters from people all around the world. Paris loves New York City. Canada loves New York City. Japan loves New York City. Just like the well-wishing and the good vibes were everywhere. I'd bought a disposable camera because once again, 2001 technology, we all didn't have an HD camera in our front pocket. I walked around and I took a lot of photos that day, and I took photos of military standing on the corners with machine guns loaded, and like, this is New York City. This is the city that is the epicenter of art and culture. And now we have military checkpoints all around it. I walked around that day and I just, oh, that's interesting. Pull out the disposable camera, take a photo. And then when I got ready to get on the subway to head back, I just threw the camera in the garbage. Like, what do I want to see these photos for? I've lived it. I've been here. I've seen history. I don't think I want to see these. And I just chucked it in a garbage can. But getting back into our good buddy, Alan Jackson, when that song came out, I mean, the lyrics they hit me like a ton of bricks. Where were you when the world stopped turning? Well, I was standing next to my dad, a man that had always been a hero to me, but had always been like a really tough football coach and not a bud. But on that day, it changed. And so I remember listening to the song on loop, tears in my eyes, and I did something I'd never done before. I wrote my dad a letter, an email actually. And I just told my dad, I said, hey, I'm glad that we got to go through all this together. It means a lot to me that we're becoming friends. And I just want to apologize for always letting you down and for disappointing you. I don't know if you know this or not, but you've always been my hero. You've always been the person that I looked up to most in this world. And I hope that this is a new beginning for us. That's me summarizing it. You're fucking crazy if you think I'm going to try to find it and read it to you. And my dad wrote me back. And he wrote me back and said that he was happy that I wrote him because he had always felt like he had let us down, that he didn't provide enough, that he didn't give enough, that he didn't work hard enough, which was like, dude, you're fucking crazy. How could you have worked any harder? How could you have given us any more? I mean, to take your family up one rung in society is insane. It's insanely hard to do that. And he did it. And so we had found that this experience was bringing us together. And now we're communicating like we've never communicated before. And I'll never forget when I said goodbye to my dad and he got in his car to drive back home. And I promised myself that I wouldn't cry telling you this story. As my dad got into his truck to head back to the States in Niagara Falls, Canada, he hugged me and he told me that he loved me. And as an adult, that is the first time I remember that tradition happening. And still to this day, when he comes to visit me or I go to visit him, when we hug goodbye before I get on a plane or he flies back home, we tell each other that we love each other. And that 100% happened because of this moment in time. And this is my experience on how this day created a relationship for me with my dad, and how on this horrible day, something very beautiful happened to me. But I would encourage you right now, if you're still hanging out with me here, think about America. October, November, December, the rest of that September in 2001. Think about how it felt to be an American. Think about how when you walked down the street and you saw somebody that was different than you, you wanted to let them know that you were on board with them. That hey man, I'm not one of the lunatics that wants to push the blame button here. I mean, just remember the unity that you felt, that we had come together as a nation because we were attacked as a nation. Remember how great that felt. And try not to think about how far away we are from that feeling and that moment today. Right? Right now we feel divided. We feel ripped apart. We feel like it's my side against your side. But after those fucking towers went down and the plane hit the ground in Pennsylvania and whatever happened in DC, we all came together. We weren't divided. And if I think back and focus on that, it wasn't exactly the saddest time that I can remember, because there was a feeling of unity and a surge of love that followed the tragedy. And it 100% it changed my life forever. It created a relationship where I didn't have one. It put trust where I didn't have any. And it forever changed who I am and who I will be. So it's funny, when you go through the worst things that you can imagine, if you can pay attention, if you can lean on love and not hate, you can always make yourself better. You can always make your world better. And you can look back on this anniversary and you can remember all of the horrible things that happened, or you can look around your life and you can remember the good things that happened. And it's up to you on how you look back and remember everything that you experience. And it's up to you to let it change you for the better or for the worse. If you spent this episode with me, I want to thank you for going on this wild ride. And I want to let you know that I feel completely honored to have this outlet, to have you, to have this community, and to be able to do what I do. I feel completely honored to be able to share this with you. And I hope that on a day that can not feel so great, that maybe this made it feel a little bit more manageable. And by no means do I ever want to discredit or take away from the loss on that day. This is just my perspective on how I lived through it, on how I went through it, and the positivity in the way that it changed my world. It changed my world for the bad in some ways, but that's a different topic for a different time. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for sharing this day with me. Go to the ones that you love and make sure that they know that you love them and that you at least say those words, because it matters so much. I'll be back here tomorrow when we get back to business as usual, but today's a different day that I think requires a different tone.